I accepted this invitation with genuine excitement because this gathering brings together exactly the kind of conversation we need in the field right now. Not just about English as a tool, but about how we manage it, integrate it, and play it with the multilingual realities of our classrooms, like Burcu you just highlighted a second ago. In my presentation, I want to take you on a journey from policy to practice, showing how the gap between strategic declarations and classroom realities can be closed, and how one framework, in particular the English medium instruction professionalization framework, EMI Prof, I call it, can help universities do just that. My key argument is simple. EMI will only realize its promise when universities treat it not as a marketing strategy or a linguistic hurdle, but as a structured, research-informed process. This is my key argument. And to do that, we need three things: collaboration, innovation, and transformation. These are the pillars that will guide us through today's journey, today's presentation. So let's begin with the first, collaboration. Now let me illustrate this gap between policy and practice with a very concrete example. At a recent BALIP EMI SIG webinar on EMI in Italy and internationalization of Italian higher education last a year ago, one of the recurring themes was the lack of meaningful mixing between domestic and international students. Instead of fostering integration, EMI often results in parallel communities, students sharing the same campus, but not the same intellectual social life. But does this actually mean for our students sitting side by side in our lecture halls, yet never truly learning together? In the chat box, someone, most likely a teacher trainer, suggested that the problem could be solved by simply training EMI lecturers, academic teachers, to use the right classroom strategies. It's an appealing narrative. Fix the teaching and the integration will follow. But this is, I would argue, a stereotypically prescriptive and reductive idea. It risks shrinking a deeply institutional socio-political issue into the narrow frame of pedagogy alone. And this is exactly why collaboration is promised so often, but rarely achieved. It is also why we need genuine innovation, not borrowed training models, but new mechanisms, such as the collaborative planning tool, which I'll return to later. And ultimately, only through transformation of policy, of quality, of professionalization, can EMI become what it promises to be. The recurring failures of integration and shallow training reveal that the current paradigm has reached its limits. And it is precisely here that we need a new one. The new paradigm, I would argue, is solution-oriented, research-inspired, theoretically anchored, and institutionally structured. It begins by placing effective student learning outcomes at the center, adopting a critical EMI stance that resists neoliberal marketization, interrogates policy non-existence and inefficacy, and recognizes that EMI is not merely a teaching technique, but a policy choice, a cultural practice, and often a political act. Only through such a shift can EMI move beyond fragmented short-term fixes and become what it promises to be: a framework for empowering teachers, advancing student learning, and sustaining multilingual ecosystems that are equitable, durable, and transformative. Having illustrated the policy-practice gap, let me now explain the theoretical ground on which I build my argument. I call this a political normative argument. It does two things at once: critiques the status quo, policy non-existence, institutional incoherence, quick pedagogical fixes. And it prescribes how EMI ought to be structured based on ethical principles, research evidence, and sound educational theory. To my knowledge, this is the first time such a political normative argument has been explicitly articulated in EMI research. Others critique neoliberalism, but their arguments remain descriptive, or may I just call it shallow. I go further, prescribing what EMI ought to be, grounded in theory and institutional design. This is why I mean by a critical EMI stance. Because higher education is not ideologically sterile. It's a battleground for neoliberal agendas, global mobility, English-only policies, and internationalization strategies driven more by markets than learning. Take Jane Knight's widely cited classic definition of internationalization, which is the integration of international, intercultural, or global dimensions into the purpose, functions, or delivery of post-secondary education. Very widely cited. At first glance, it seems neutral, but as Buchner shows, it is depoliticized and dehistoricized. Internationalization often advances capitalist logics, cloaked in ideals of global citizenship and intercultural competencies. In practice, universities end up competing for students and resources, reinforcing inequality, not dismantling it. This is why I anchor my approach in two theoretical traditions: Frankfurt School's critical social theory, interrogating ideology, power, and inequality in social domains, including higher education, and Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, reminding us learning is always socially mediated, institutional shaped, politically situated. Together, they reveal what the dominant orthodoxy conceals. EMI is never just about language or classrooms. It is about the structures and ideologies that shape who benefits, who participates, and under what conditions. And with this foundation, we can now step back and look at EMI globally, its definitions, scope, and orthodoxies that continue to frame it. If you now turn to the question of definitions, we quickly see that there is no consensus in the literature about what EMI actually is. But there is a striking pattern. Despite the variety, almost all dominant definitions share three things in common. They are non-Anglophone centric. They place emphasis squarely on the E, English, in EMI. And they frame EMI as a teaching practice, teacher-centric rather than learning-centered. Now, defining in particular has become iconic in the field, that definition, back in 2014. A group of Oxford researchers, Mustafa Macro, Catherine Walter, Julie Deirdre, and Ting Zhao, they collectively defined EMI as the use of English to teach academic subjects in non-Anglophone countries or regions. This definition has shaped the perspectives of EMI stakeholders for more than a decade. When I joined the EMI research team at Oxford in 2014, the very first debate I encountered was about scope. Which context should even count as EMI? For example, the team had debated whether Miami, where Spanish is widely spoken, could be considered and EMI context. The decision then was no, on the grounds that the USA is an Anglophone country. But when I asked for my view, I argued yes, because to me, EMI is not about the dominant language of the country. It is about the demographics of the lecture room. It should be. If a class brings together students and lecturers who are non-native speakers of English, then EMI is taking place, regardless of geography. That's my argument. And this is the crucial point. Challenges of equity, participation, and learning transcend geography. They are not confined to so-called non-Anglophone contexts. They are structural, institutional, and global. This is important because the dominant orthodoxy of EMI has consistently disregarded Anglophone context, as if they were somehow irrelevant. Yet, as I and others, including Wingate and Pecorari and Malmstern, have argued, there are actually more similarities than differences between Anglophone and non-Anglophone lecture rooms. That conviction guided me to propose my own definition back in 2023, one that deliberately breaks from orthodoxy. I define EMI as the use of English, whether through sole use, partial use, code switching, or other forms, by both students and content teachers to teach and learn academic subjects rather than English itself, within university settings, regardless of their locale. Unlike the others, this definition is not non-Anglophone centric. It is explicitly learning centered, explicitly location neutral, and it recognizes the multiple ways English may function in higher education. In other words, it resituates EMI not as a narrow teaching technique, but as a complex institutional practice, whose legitimacy must ultimately be judged by student learning outcomes. And this brings us directly to the next step. If definitions have been vague, partial, or ideologically slanted, how has EMI research evolved on that shaky foundation? And what has that meant for the field? That's where now we turn. The dominant orthodoxy of EMI did not emerge in a vacuum. It is rooted in the essentialist orthodoxy of development that took hold after World War II. This worldview framed universities as engines for producing human capital, designed to fuel economic growth. Within that logic, multilingualism was cast not as a resource, actually, but as a barrier. Language policies became instruments of control, deciding which languages counted in commerce, education, and politics, and which did not. That ideology flowed directly into EMI, historically. What I call the dominant EMI school has three defining features. It is non-Anglophone centric, focusing almost exclusively outside the Anglophone world. It is E-centric, privileging English proficiency over student learning, and it follows a linear applied linguistics trajectory: ESL, CLIL, EAP, ESP, and finally EMI. The policy logic mirrors this. Policymakers assume that teaching in good enough English will suffice. If necessary, lecturers can be trained to patch gaps. Dedicated language support is cut while universities continue to profit in prestige, rankings, and revenue, often without ever adopting an explicit EMI policy. This is why EMI has been reduced to its linguistic dimension, stripped of its sociopolitical complexity, and comfortably aligned with neoliberal higher education agendas. But here is the catch. EMI research has mirrored the same orthodoxy. Too often, it has been theoretically weak and methodologically fragmented. Rather than building its own independent spine, the field has leaned on borrowed tools from applied linguistics, fixating on effectiveness studies, perception studies, and proficiency counts. The result? Data without depth, disconnected from theories of learning. That's my interpretation. Systematic reviews, Makora et al., 2018, Hampson and McKinley, more recently, 2024, consolidate findings, but rarely question their assumptions. As Han 2023 notes, the field is circling the same questions, recycling the same variables. So, the question we must ask is, are we truly advancing knowledge, or are we simply circling the same questions in slightly different ways? This is why I argue that EMI research exemplifies what Tumula critiques, an accumulation of empirically rich but theoretically impoverished studies, mirrored statements, redundant findings, repetitive approaches, producing what I call research noise. And here is where my work departs. Rather than adding to the noise, I insist on a paradigm shift from method-driven cataloging to theory-driven construction. This is the originality of my position. I frame EMI not only through critique, but through what I call a political normative argument. Not just asking what EMI is, but prescribing what EMI ought to be, based on ethical principles, research evidence, and educational theory. For me, EMI must be anchored in two established theoretical anchors and strengthened by one integrative program. Sociocultural theory, seeing EMI as a mediated process of learning. Critical social theory, situating EMI within global hierarchies, neoliberal forms, and the struggle for epistemic justice. And to bridge them, I add epistemic coordination, not another theory, but an integrative program that weaves together fragmented strands of EMI research into a coherent agenda, aligning policy, pedagogy, and research design so evidence becomes actionable knowledge. When guided by these two anchors and this integrative program, EMI research can finally move beyond shallow comparisons, I'd call, and proficiency count, and begin to tackle what truly matters: how EMI structures learning, how it distributes opportunity, and how it positions the university as a site of liberation. This is my solution-oriented paradigm shift. It integrates critique with construction, research with reform, and it is the necessary step if EMI is to mature as a field. And with this foundation in place, we can now turn to policy and quality, the institutional pillars without which EMI risks becoming little more than a hollow promise. If EMI research has too often been noisy, EMI policy has too often been absent, or worse, cosmetic. Kortman's Institutional Language Policy Report for LERU, League of European Research Universities, in 2019 was blunt. The absence of robust EMI policy undermines the quality of teaching and learning even at Europe's most research-intensive universities. And the telling detail is this: since that report, not a single LERU university has created a dedicated EMI policy. This mirrors the pattern I outlined earlier: method-driven research without theory, and now policy rhetoric without substance. Both leave EMI fragile, fragmented, and incoherent. And nowhere is this incoherence more revealing than in the idea of quality. I argue that EMI quality is the most assumed quality concept in global circulation, endlessly invoked by policymakers, managers, students, parents, even the business world. Everyone, including the French government, as you can see the poster just promoting French higher education to the international students, seemed to know what it meant. Everyone had their version of it. And yet the literature somehow avoided defining it. Until my own intervention, EMI quality remained an empty signifier. So in my own work, I have proposed the first explicit definition of EMI quality in the literature as the level of excellence at which an institutional EMI policy is reflected in pedagogy, in student learning outcomes, and in alumni performance. This definition matters because it resituates quality away from prestige or rankings and anchors it instead in alignment between policy declarations, classroom practice, and long-term outcomes. And that alignment turns quality from an abstract ideal into a measurable, accountable process. But here lies the paradox. In the absence of robust EMI policy, the burden falls almost entirely on teachers. They are left to improvise, unsupported, uncoordinated, and isolated within their disciplines. And this, again, is why collaboration cannot remain rhetorical. It must be structured, theory-informed, and institutionally embedded, which brings us directly to the collaborative planning tool. Too often, EMI teacher training has been framed as a quick fix. Train the lecturers English, borrow methods from EAP or ESL, and the assumption is problem solved. But as the evidence shows, these fixes rarely deliver lasting change. This is why, during my time at Oxford, I designed a different kind of intervention, the Collaborative Planning Tool, or CPT. It was not a workshop, not a remedial patch, but a structured mechanism grounded in sociocultural theory. And it was the first tool in EMI research deliberately designed to operationalize Vygotskian principles of socially mediated learning into academic practice. The study ran from 2014 to 2016 across 9 Turkish universities. EMI lecturers and EAP specialists paired up. They co-planned 8 consecutive lessons, with each cycle feeding forward into the next through structured reflection. The outcomes were significant. EMI lecturers reported sharper awareness of how language mediates disciplinary knowledge. EAP specialists gained deeper insight into the teaching of disciplinary content. Both groups, lecturers and EAP specialists, declared genuine professional learning from each other. And most importantly, students themselves reported that they were learning their academic subjects more effectively in those lessons. The final point matters because when students articulate a shift in their learning, we are no longer in the realm of abstract training, but measurable impact. But let me stress, while CPT worked, it was still a local intervention. And here comes the normative argument. If collaboration remains ad hoc, dependent on goodwill, it will never transform institutions. What CPT demonstrates is that structured, theory-informed collaboration can cut through silos, overcome the limits of quick fix training, and deliver tangible benefits for students. The real challenge is to move from isolated projects to institutionalization. That means embedding collaboration into governance, policy, and quality frameworks, which is precisely the step that professionalization and the EMI Prof are designed to address. Let me pause here, because this is not just an academic argument about definitions or training. What I'm really arguing for is a paradigm shift in how we understand and develop EMI in universities. Up to now, EMI research and practice have been dominated by what I call the essentialist orthodoxy, narrow problem listing studies, quick fixed training models borrowed from ESL and or EAP, and policies that are ad hoc, compliance-driven or prestige-driven. The result, EMI has been reduced to a patchwork field, prestige-focused, method-driven, but lacking theoretical depth. My critical EMI stance rejects that orthodoxy. Instead, I argue that EMI must be understood as a deeply political and normative project. Why? Because universities are not neutral. EMI is not neutral. Every policy, every training, every definition of quality reflects decisions about power, inequality, and opportunity. That's why throughout this presentation, I've been arguing us to anchor EMI more firmly in theories that expose and transform. Critical social theory, which interrogates how ideology, neoliberal reform, and inequality shape our universities, our classrooms, and our student opportunities. Sociocultural theory, which reminds us that learning is never a technical transaction, but a socially mediated, collaborative, language-based process. When we apply these lenses, EMI stops being a neutral policy mechanism. It becomes what it truly is, a site of struggle over knowledge, equity, and learning. And here is my normative claim. If EMI is to be legitimate, it must be professionalized. By this, I mean EMI must be built into a coherent, structured, and accountable practice within universities. Not an add-on, not a remedial patch, but a profession in its own right. I define EMI professionalization as the systemic process through which content teachers acquire the status of EMI professionals, supported by formal governance and accountability within higher education institutions. This is the first systemic definition of EMI professionalization in the literature. And I define the EMI professionals as academic content teachers and managers who hold certified competencies, enabling them to undertake teaching and managerial roles within higher education settings. We earlier defined these competencies as the expert knowledge, understanding, and skills needed to effectively teach academic subjects via EMI. These are political choices, not just academic ones, but they position EMI lecturers not as a failed linguists, but as professionals with distinctive expertise. To underpin this, I brought together three strands never before combined in EMI. Fritz's definition of professional, which is grounded in specialist knowledge and peer accountability. Heriot-Watt's sources of professionalization, which provides the distinction between professionalization from above, regulation, certification, and from within, peer-led, showing why universities themselves must lead this process. And Solberg-Englund's concept of professional responsibility and accountability, ensuring EMI answers not only to institutions, but to students and society. Taken together, these strands form the theoretical foundation for EMI professionalization, but theory alone is not enough. They demand to be operationalized, not in abstract, but in a framework that universities can actually implement. That framework is the EMI Prof, I call, the first comprehensive model linking policy, pedagogy, quality, and professional development through professionalization. But let me emphasize something crucial. Professionalization risks becoming empty bureaucracy unless it is infused with critical values. If universities treat it as box ticking, a set of checklists, certificates, or compliance rituals, hardly anything changes. Instead, the EMI Prof is deliberately built on three critical pillars. Multilingualism. EMI must not reproduce English-only policies. It should instead leverage the full linguistic repertoires of students and teachers, making classrooms more inclusive culturally, sustaining, and pedagogically richer. Freiren liberation. Universities are not neutral sites of knowledge transfer. They are spaces of struggle and possibility. Grounded in critical pedagogy, EMI becomes a vehicle for dialogue, agency, and collaborative knowledge making. English as an international language. EMI classrooms are not extensions of native speaker norms. They are multilingual, multicultural, dynamic spaces where English functions as a flexible shared resource for disciplinary learning. Taken together, these pillars position EMI as more than a quick fix or branding strategy. They anchor it in a solution-oriented paradigm, one directly linked to student learning, policy reform, and institutional quality enhancement. But the EMI Prof is not just about values, it's also about process. It advances through three iterative stages. Policy design. Institutions must first articulate clear, accountable EMI policies that embed multilingualism, equity, and quality at the core. Pedagogical development. These policies must then be translated into structured professional development, certification pathways, and collaborative practices that empower lecturers as EMI professionals. Outcomes and evaluation. Finally, effectiveness must be judged not by prestige or English proficiency, but by student academic learning outcomes, graduate success, and institutional transformation. And because these strategies are iterative, the process loops forward, evaluation feeds back into policy refinement, which in turn reshapes pedagogy. This cycle ensures that EMI professionalization is not static or cosmetic, but genuinely developmental and sustainable. But there's one further caveat. The EMI Prof must not become another neoliberal instrument for metrics or rankings or competitive prestige. If a university really feels the need to outsource to actors like the British Council, for example, it must remember the imperial legacies, as Philipson argues. In other words, let me put it lightly, if you invite the British Council to dinner, don't be surprised if they try to rewrite the menu for you. Instead, universities should draw on their own internal resources to adapt this framework critically and contextually, reclaiming EMI as a tool for empowerment rather than allowing it to be co-opted as just another mechanism for marketization. Let me close with this. Through this presentation, I have argued that EMI cannot remain what it has too often been: fragmented, linguistically reductionist, and aligned with neoliberal logics of competition or prestige. Instead, I have advanced a political normative argument. EMI must be understood as a deeply institutional, deeply theoretical, and deeply emancipatory project. This is why I have proposed a solution-oriented paradigm, one that resists research noise, shallow training, and cosmetic policy, and instead grounds EMI in theory, practice, and responsibility. The EMI Prof offers us a pathway, but it is only as strong as the critical awareness and institutional courage with which we implement it. And so here is my final claim. EMI will only fulfill its promise when it is no longer a battleground of policy noise, but a shared project of empowerment, where multilingualism, equity, and liberation are not optional extras, but the very core of academic life. That requires collaboration, innovation, and transformation. The three pillars we began with, and the three imperatives that must guide us forward. Before I finish my presentation, I'd also like to share the upcoming special issue of Journal of English Medium Instruction. We've been working on that. I'm the guest editor, and the special focus of this special issue is just mobilizing knowledge to catalyze change. So research and conceptual work, we are accepting the abstracts until the end of this month, and could be conceptual work or research-based work. And we'd like to see how change is planned for and implemented, rather than ad hoc or coincidental. So thank you very much for being so patient and following my presentation. And I think that there are references, and I assume this will be available through the conference website. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.